There is a moment, rare, unrepeatable, when a child stops being a child in the eyes of the world and becomes something else entirely. Not an adult, not yet, but something that makes grown men in uniform pause, look at each other, and quietly step aside. That moment happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the garden of a royal residence, and the person who caused it was 9 years old. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She did not run to find her father or tug at anyone's sleeve. She simply stood her ground, looked the guard directly in the eye, and spoke. 4 sentences. Calm, clear, certain. And Camilla, the Queen Consort of England, a woman who had spent decades learning which battles were worth fighting inside palace walls, heard those 4 sentences from across the garden path, stopped walking, and told the guards to stand down. People who were there that day say they still think about it. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. Because a little girl with her mother's eyes and her father's posture simply knew something about herself, about the moment, about what was right, and said it out loud without flinching. This is the story of how that happened, and everything that quietly built toward it year by year in the rooms and corridors and carefully managed public appearances of a life that is never fully private and never fully free. Charlotte Elizabeth Diana was born on the 2nd of May, 2015, and at 8:34 in the morning, and the world outside St. Mary's Hospital in London filled with people who had been waiting since dawn, holding flags and portable speakers and the particular kind of patient excitement that only the British seem able to sustain through cold and drizzle without complaint. She weighed 8 pounds and 3 ounces. She had her mother's mouth. She had, already, a kind of stillness about her face that the nurses in the room would mention quietly to each other later, as though they were describing something they hadn't quite expected to see in a newborn. By the time she was 2, she was already a subject of public conversation that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with what she represented. A princess. A spare for the spare, some commentators said, which was a phrase as cold as it was accurate. She had an older brother, George, who carried the full weight of future kingship on shoulders that were still too small for the blazers they put him in. She would, the commentators noted, have more freedom than him. She would also have less purpose in the official sense. She would have to find her own shape inside a structure that had been built long before she arrived. What nobody wrote in those early articles, because nobody could have known yet, was that Charlotte was going to be just fine with that. She grew up between 2 worlds that never fully merged. There was the world of Kensington Palace, the schedules and security briefings and careful management of image, the understanding from a very young age that cameras were always somewhere nearby, that behavior in public was a kind of communication, that the way you held yourself said things before you ever opened your mouth. And there was the other world, the one Kate and William worked hard to protect. School runs and birthday parties and muddy Wellington boots, and the particular low-key domesticity that her parents had decided, early and firmly, was non-negotiable. Charlotte would have both. She would learn to move between them without losing her footing in either. The school she attended, Thomas's Battersea in London, was a place where the other children were instructed, delicately, to treat her as they would treat anyone else. And for the most part, they did. Children are practical in ways adults are not. She was Charlotte, who was good at gymnastics and liked drawing, and got annoyed when her brother talked over her during car rides. The title was a fact about her life, not the whole of it. But she was watching. Always watching. This was something teachers noticed early. In group settings, Charlotte tended to observe before she participated. She was not shy. Shyness suggests discomfort, and then she did not seem uncomfortable. She seemed to be gathering information, taking the temperature of a room, deciding where she stood before she said anything. Her reception teacher, speaking to a parent years later at a school event, described it as an unusual quality in a small child. She said it was like watching someone who already understood that words, once said, could not be unsaid. Her mother was the primary architect of her early education in this regard. Kate had her own complicated relationship with public life. She had come into it from the outside, had learned its textures without having been born into them, and that particular experience gave her a different kind of fluency than someone raised inside the system. She could see it from two angles simultaneously. She knew what it looked like from the public side and what it felt like from the private side, and she taught Charlotte, in small ways and large ones, to hold both views at once. To understand why the cameras were there without letting them be the thing that defined her. William contributed something different. He had grown up at the center of the machine, had been formed by its pressures and shaped by its losses, and he carried in him a specific kind of caution about the institution, not disloyalty, but clear-eyed awareness. He told his children things, age-appropriate versions of real things, because he believed that ignorance was not protection. Preparation was protection. Charlotte absorbed this. She absorbed most things. By the time she was 5 or 6, people at official appearances were beginning to notice something that was difficult to articulate precisely. She had a presence, not performance. There is a difference, and it matters. Performed confidence is wide, declarative, designed to be seen. Real confidence is quiet. It takes up space without announcing that it is doing so. Charlotte, at 6, standing beside her father during a public engagement, had the quality of someone who had decided she belonged there and had nothing further to prove about it. She also had a temper. This is important and often left out. She was not a serene child in private. She was fierce, according to family accounts, and she had opinions that she expressed without significant concern for whether those opinions were convenient for anyone. Thus she and George had the ordinary friction of siblings close in age, competitive, sometimes unkind, quickly forgiven. She pushed back against Louis when he was small enough that pushing back against him felt unfair to everyone but her. She argued with her parents. She was not, in the domestic sense, easy, but she was honest. Consistently, almost inconveniently honest. She said what she saw. She said what she thought was wrong. She did not soften things to make them more comfortable, because nobody had taught her that was necessary. Kate believed in honesty as a value more than tact as a social skill, and it showed in her daughter. There was a moment documented by a royal correspondent who happened to be positioned correctly at a garden party at Windsor when Charlotte was 7, where she corrected a member of the household staff who had referred to the flowers in a display by the wrong name. She did it without condescension, just matter-of-factly, the way you would correct a minor error in a conversation with a friend. The staff member thanked her. Charlotte nodded and moved on. The correspondent wrote about it not as a precocious moment, but as something almost adult in its normality. A child who noticed things and said so. That quality, noticing, naming, moving on, would be precisely what she reached for 2 years later in the garden. But the garden was not the beginning. The beginning was much quieter than that. It was a Tuesday morning in the kitchen of their Norfolk home when Charlotte, aged 6, stood at the counter watching her mother arrange something on a tray and said without preamble, "I think people should say what they mean, Mum. It's faster." Kate had stopped what she was doing and looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "It usually is." Charlotte went back to her cereal, but Kate would think about that sentence for years afterward. About the specific confidence of a child who had arrived already at a conclusion that most people spend decades circling. She was being prepared for something. The whole architecture of her upbringing was preparation, not for a specific role, not for a crown, but for the harder and more general thing of being a person of consequence in a world that would always be watching. The pens she would later scatter across a stone path, the guard who would step aside, on the quiet in her voice that would make everyone in the garden stop. It was all coming. She just didn't know the shape of it yet. The relationship between Charlotte and Camilla did not begin warmly, because relationships between children and step-grandparents rarely do. They begin with observation, with careful sizing up, with the low-level social negotiation that children conduct mostly in silence. Charlotte was 4 when her grandfather Charles married Camilla Parker Bowles in 2005. No, that is wrong. Charlotte was not yet born. But Charlotte grew up in a family in which Camilla's place was already established, already complicated, already layered with decades of history that Charlotte was too young to understand and old enough to sense. She sensed it the way children sense things, not through information, but through atmosphere. The way certain names landed differently in different rooms. The way certain subjects shifted the weight of a conversation without anyone acknowledging the shift. Charlotte did not know the full story of her grandmother Diana and what had come before and what had hurt whom and in what order. But she knew that the adults around her held feelings about Camilla that were not simple, and that those feelings lived in the house quietly, like furniture nobody commented on, but everyone navigated around. What Charlotte discovered, on her own schedule and through her own observation, was that Camilla herself was not simple either. She was funny, for one thing. Charlotte had not expected that. She was dry in the way that people who have survived a great deal often are. Not sarcastic, not mean, but possessed of a humor that came from having looked at the absurdity of things directly and decided to find it entertaining rather than exhausting. Charlotte responded to this the way children respond to adults who take humor seriously. She paid attention. Camilla was also honest in a way that was different from Kate's honesty. Kate's honesty was principled. She told the truth because she believed in truth as a value. Camilla's honesty was more pragmatic. She told the truth because she had learned at great personal cost that the alternative made everything worse. There was something Charlotte recognized in this, even if she couldn't have articulated what. 2 different paths arriving at the same place. By the time Charlotte was 7, she had begun to study Camilla the way she studied most things that interested her, quietly, from a slight distance, collecting data before forming conclusions. She noticed that Camilla was always at ease in rooms where other people were not, that she had the specific social confidence of someone who had decided at some point to simply stop performing and be whoever she actually was, and had found that to be sufficient. She noticed that Camilla moved through official engagements without the visible effort that some members of the family showed. Not boredom, not detachment, but an economy of presence that Charlotte found interesting. She also noticed that Camilla watched her back, not in a surveillance sense. In the way of someone who had been watching the people in this family for decades and had not yet stopped. And the dynamic between them developed slowly, built through shared moments that were too small to be recorded anywhere. A brief exchange over dogs at a country house gathering where Camilla had said something dry about the spaniel's opinion of the proceedings, and Charlotte had laughed in a way she hadn't expected to. A moment at a formal dinner when Charlotte, bored and 8 years old, had been seated 2 chairs from Camilla and had received, from that direction, and a look of such complete and unsentimental solidarity that Charlotte had nearly laughed again. She didn't, but she remembered it. The year Charlotte turned 8, the family attended a garden party at Windsor that was, as these things always were, precisely organized to appear casual. Staff had been positioned, routes had been planned, security protocols had been mapped and communicated and mapped again. There were flowers. There was a specific kind of English garden sunshine that appears only in June and lasts approximately 4 days before giving way to gray. There were children present, some of Charlotte's age, the offspring of other guests, and for a portion of the afternoon Charlotte had been allowed to move with relative freedom through the garden, while adults conducted the business of being publicly pleasant to one another. She had found the back section of the garden where the formal paths ended and the less managed hedgerows began, and she had been there perhaps 10 minutes before she encountered the thing that would, 1 year later, teach her something she carried into the moment that would define her in other people's minds. There was a gardener's assistant there, a young man, perhaps 19, who had clearly not expected to be found in that section of the garden by anyone important, and who was, in the manner of someone caught doing nothing wrong but fearing it would be interpreted otherwise, behaving with a kind of exaggerated nervousness that Charlotte recognized even at 8. He had a pair of clippers. He had been cutting back a section of the hedgerow. He had stopped the moment he saw her, and his expression had done the particular thing that people's expressions did when they saw her: the recalibration, and the loading of a specific kind of self-consciousness. And Charlotte had found it, as she usually did, both understandable and faintly exhausting. She had said hello. He had said hello back. She had asked what he was cutting. He had told her. She had asked if the hedgerow needed it or if it was being shaped for the party, and he had been surprised enough by the question that he had answered honestly. It was being shaped. It didn't actually need it. But the head groundskeeper liked a certain silhouette for events. Charlotte had nodded and said that made sense and moved on. It was a 2-minute conversation, but she thought about it later, not because of what was said, but because of the moment before the hello. The moment when his expression had shifted and she had watched him decide how to stand in front of her. And she had understood, with the particular clarity of a child who has been observing adults for years, that many people would spend her entire life deciding how to stand in front of her before she had said a single word, that the title arrived before she did in every room, that she would always be managing the gap between who she actually was and what people had already decided she was before they met her. Kate had talked to her about this in abstract terms. William had talked to her about it in more direct terms. But this was the first time she had felt it as a full sensation rather than a concept. It was not frightening. It was clarifying. She brought it up with Camilla 3 weeks later at a family gathering in a way that was slightly too direct for the setting. Charlotte had a habit of raising things at imperfect moments, which was either a character flaw or a superpower depending on who you asked. She had said, plainly, that she had been thinking about how people treated her before they knew her. So Camilla had been quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone gathering a diplomatic answer, the quiet of someone taking the question seriously. Then she had said something that Charlotte would not repeat word for word to anyone for years, because it felt private in the way that real things are private. The gist of it was this, that it never stopped, not entirely, but that you could learn to move through it in a way that didn't cost you anything. And that the key was not to confuse how people saw you with how you were. That those were two separate things, and keeping them separate was the work. Charlotte was 8 years old. She processed this over a very long time. By the time she was 9, she had processed enough. The afternoon of the garden was a Thursday in late September, one of those days the English autumn produces occasionally as a form of apology for what is coming. Still warm, the light at that specific amber angle that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. There had been a small formal gathering at the residence earlier in the day, family and a handful of guests, and it had concluded and dispersed in the way these things do, with the particular organized gradualness of events that are managed by professionals. Charlotte had slipped away from the main terrace while the adults were finishing their conversations, and which was something she did when she needed air that didn't have obligation in it. The garden behind the main path was where she usually went on these occasions. It was quieter. The staff generally moved toward the front of the property during the wind-down of events, and the back garden offered the specific quality she was looking for on that afternoon, which was the sensation of being briefly unobserved. This is a sensation that does not sound like much to most people and means a great deal to someone who has never in their life been fully certain of it. She had been there perhaps 8 minutes when the boy appeared. He was perhaps 10 or 11, one of the children who had been brought along by a guest family, and he had found the garden by the same instinct that Charlotte had. The desire to be somewhere that wasn't the adult gathering. He had a football that he had found or brought, and he was kicking it against the low garden wall with the rhythmic single-mindedness of a child who has converted boredom into a project. He had not seen her yet. Charlotte watched him for a moment. She recognized the specific absorbed quality of what he was doing, the way he was entirely inside the simple physical task of it, nothing else existing. She almost said nothing. She almost just watched. And then the ball went wide and bounced toward the section of the garden that was on the other side of the security perimeter. Not significantly, not dramatically, just enough. Across a low hedge that marked the formal boundary. The boy went after it without thinking, which is what children do. They see the ball, they go after the ball. The intermediary fact of the boundary did not register. The guard who moved was one of the two positioned at the rear corner of the property. He moved quickly, not roughly. He was trained for this, trained to intercept before a situation developed into something requiring more force. And he stepped directly into the boy's path with his body and a single short word of instruction. Stop. The boy stopped. He looked up. He was not frightened exactly, but he was the particular kind of startled that tips toward frightened. And his face did the thing that children's faces do when an authority that outweighs them has appeared without warning. The calculation of whether he had done something wrong, the rapid inventory of what the consequences might be. He had not done anything wrong. He had chased a ball. He was 10 years old, and he had chased a ball. Charlotte had watched all of this happen in approximately 4 seconds. She had watched the boy's face. She had watched the guard's posture. Professional, impersonal, doing precisely what he had been positioned to do. She had watched the specific quality of the moment, the small injustice of it, the disproportionate weight of institutional authority landing on a child who had simply lost control of a football. She walked over. This part is what people who were nearby described differently, depending on where they were standing and what angle they had on it. Some say she walked. Some say she moved with purpose. Now, one person present said she arrived without seeming to have crossed the distance between where she was and where she needed to be, which is probably not literally true, but says something accurate about the quality of her movement. She was not running. She was not hesitating either. She said something to the guard. 4 sentences by most accounts. The substance of them was this: that the boy had chased a ball and not intended to cross a boundary, and that the boundary was not clearly marked from the angle he had approached it, that she was vouching for him, and that he should be allowed to retrieve his ball and return. She said it the way someone says a thing they believe is self-evidently correct and are presenting as a courtesy to the other person, before it becomes necessary to say it less pleasantly. The guard looked at her. He was not a young man. He had been in this work for years, had done these rotations many times. He had developed the specific professional neutrality that security work requires. He was not someone who could easily be moved by social pressure or by rank alone. He had his training. He had his protocols. He looked at her for what people describe as a long moment, though it was probably 3 seconds. Then he stepped aside. The boy retrieved his ball. He said thank you to Charlotte with a kind of dazed gratitude, the way you thank someone who has pulled you out of water. Charlotte told him the hedge was unclear and that wasn't his fault. Then she walked back toward the garden path. Camilla had come around the far corner during the last part of this. She had been walking with one of the guests and had caught the tail end, enough to see the guard step aside, enough to see Charlotte walking back, enough to understand the shape of what had happened without having heard the specific words. She had stopped. The guest beside her had also stopped, and sensing the shift in her attention. Camilla had looked at the guard. She had said, in a quiet tone that required no amplification, that he had made the right call, that the child was fine, that everything could stand down. The guard nodded. Standard acknowledgement of instruction. But the people nearby, the guest, A staff member who had come around the corner at the same moment noted something about the way Camilla said it, not as correction of the guard's earlier action, not as overruling anyone, as confirmation, as a woman of authority confirming that a smaller person of authority had handled something correctly, and that the record should reflect this. Charlotte, who had not seen Camilla arrive, turned at the sound of her voice. They looked at each other across perhaps 15 feet of garden path. The amber afternoon light was doing its September thing on the stones. The boy had gone back to his football against the wall, re-inhabiting his project with the resilience of someone who had decided the event was over. Camilla held Charlotte's gaze for a moment. Then she gave a very slight nod. Not theatrical, not performative. The kind of nod that means, yes, that was the right thing, and you knew it, and you did it anyway. Charlotte nodded back. Same energy, same economy. The guest beside Camilla asked quietly what that had been about. Camilla thought about it for a second and then said something brief, and the guest would repeat it later. She said, "That's what it looks like when you've actually done the work." She was not, everyone who heard it understood, talking about the guard. After events like that one, there is usually a version of the story that gets out. Not the full version. The full version stays in the garden, in the memories of the people who were positioned correctly to see it. What gets out is a shape, an outline, and something a staff member mentions to someone who mentions it elsewhere, and the compression that happens in that passage strips away the texture and leaves behind the fact. Charlotte said something. The guard stepped back. Camilla confirmed it. That is the version that moved. The reaction to it in certain circles was interesting to observe, and there were people who found it admirable in a straightforward way. A 9-year-old who had intervened on behalf of a child who could not advocate for himself, who had done so calmly and without drama, who had been correct. There were people who found it quietly unsettling in a way they could not fully articulate, which usually means the thing touches something that people have complicated feelings about. Authority, inheritance, and the question of what a child should or should not be capable of at 9. There were people who saw it purely through the lens of the institution. A junior member of the family navigating a security situation appropriately, demonstrating the kind of judgment the family cultivates, evidence that the next generation is being prepared well. William heard about it that evening. The account he received came from one of the staff, who described it in the careful, factual way that palace staff describe events that are not emergencies but are worth noting. He listened. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he asked one question, what had she said exactly, and listened to the best reconstruction available. Then he said thank you, and that was the end of the formal account. He found Charlotte later, doing something unremarkable in the family sitting room, reading or drawing, accounts differ, and he sat down near her and asked, in a tone that was not parental and not professional, but something between the two, whether she wanted to tell him about the afternoon. She told him. She described it in the matter-of-fact way she described most things, without performance and without seeking any particular response from him, the way you recount a thing that happened and was significant but is now finished. She said she hadn't thought about it much. She said the boy had looked scared, and it wasn't his fault. The William said, "How did you know the guard would listen?" Charlotte thought about this seriously, the way she thought about serious questions. She said she hadn't known. She had said what she said because it was the right thing to say, and she believed it, and she figured that was the guard's job, to make right calls. She said she had trusted him to do his job. William was quiet. The specific quality of what his daughter had just said was not lost on him. And he had grown up inside this institution, understanding power primarily as something that flowed downward, that hierarchy produced compliance, that rank created movement in people below it, that the name and the title did work in rooms before a person arrived. And Charlotte had done something different. She had not invoked rank. She had invoked reason. She had offered the guard a correct argument and trusted him to recognize its correctness. Oh, she had treated him as a professional capable of making a good decision when given good information. He told her she had done well. He was careful not to inflate it, which was a parenting instinct he was deliberate about. He did not want her to begin calculating how to reproduce a feeling of his approval, because that way produced a very specific kind of warping in people. He said she had done well, and that he was glad she had been paying attention. Thus Charlotte nodded and went back to what she was doing. But the conversation between them left something in the room that lingered. William went to bed that night thinking about the question of what he had passed to his children and what they had found on their own, and whether those were separable things. He thought about what it had cost him to learn the things Charlotte seemed to have arrived at through observation alone. He thought about his mother, about Diana, who had also had that quality of reading rooms and people at speed and responding to what was actually there rather than the protocol of what was supposed to be there. He did not let himself think this thought for long, because it still hurt in the place where grief lives permanently. But he thought it briefly, and it was not an unhappy thought. Kate heard about it from Charlotte directly, the following morning, over breakfast. Charlotte mentioned it in passing, literally in passing, as while getting up from the table to put her bowl in the sink, which was so characteristic of her that Kate sat with the information for a long time after she left the room. Kate thought about the version of this she had told Charlotte, abstractly and practically, over years of small conversations. The version about using your voice when something is wrong. The version about the fact that silence in the face of a small injustice is a choice as much as speaking is. And the version about knowing the difference between the moments that require protocol and the moments that require presence. She had said all of those things. She believed all of those things. She had said them because she meant them, not because she had known there would be a day in a garden when they would be needed. And Charlotte had gone into that day carrying them without knowing she was carrying them. The way you carry everything that has actually become part of you, not as a lesson you remember, but as a reflex you don't have to think about. This is what it looks like, Kate thought, when something has actually worked. Camilla did not speak to Charlotte directly about the event until several weeks later, at a family occasion where they happened to find themselves briefly in the same room without many other people present. And Camilla was not someone who made emotional moments ceremonial. She had lived long enough to know that ceremonial emotional moments often collapse under their own weight. She mentioned it briefly, in the sideways way she handled things that mattered. She said she had heard Charlotte had dealt with something in the garden. Charlotte said yes. Camilla said she thought that had been right. Charlotte said thank you. Then Camilla said one more thing. And this is the part that Charlotte would turn over in her mind for years, the way you turn over a sentence that says more than it appears to say. She said, "People will spend your entire life deciding what you are before you open your mouth. The only answer to that is to make sure that when you do open your mouth, what comes out is true and clear enough that it doesn't matter what they thought before." She said it looking at something across the room. In the manner of someone delivering a thing they have earned the right to say because they learned it the hard way, in the full public view, across many years and many rooms and many judgments that had not been kind. Charlotte looked at her. Then she said, "That's what I did." Camilla looked back at her then. Direct. The two of them measuring each other in the way that people measure each other when they recognize something shared. "Yes," Camilla said. Oh, it was. There is no tidy ending to the story of who Charlotte is becoming, because she is 9 years old and the story is still happening and the people inside it are still living it, day by day, in all the unglamorous ordinary detail that never makes it into the articles. The girl who argued with her brother in the car and got muddy in Norfolk and learned to navigate the gap between who she was and who people decided she was before she got there, she is still all of those things. She will probably always be all of those things. But she is also the girl who walked across 15 feet of garden path on a September afternoon, said 4 sentences she believed were true, and trusted another person to be good enough at their job to hear them. She was 9. That is the part worth remembering.